At this point in the program, we'd like to move on to our next guest speaker. He is a state senator from Melbourne. He chairs the Senate Finance and Tax Committee. Senator Dowell, thank you, sir.
Thank you, and can everyone hear me okay? I'd like to thank everyone taking the time and Florida TaxWatch for putting this on, and in particular, I really appreciate what TaxWatch does for the people of the state of Florida as an entity that brings attention to many, many critical issues affecting the state. And of course, we all probably are the rare breed that kind of enjoys talking about the issue of taxes. I mean, it's one issue that a lot of politicians want to avoid, but it was my first priority for a committee assignments, and I was extremely honored and flattered that Senate President chose me to chair Finance and Tax. And what a time to do it. We could not find a more challenging time. And, you know, I have to tell you, with challenges comes opportunities. And I hope that the revenue shortfalls that we're facing right now can be a catalyst to have Florida really not only take a look at our tax problems, but also to take action to fix them permanently. You know, when you look at the tax problem we face, the first word I think of is the F word. That's right, the F word, fairness. So that's my theme, fairness. Dominic was thinking something else, but I really truly believe that when we start the process, and the process for the Florida Senate will start tomorrow, where we start looking at one of three assignments and tasks that the Senate President has given the Finance and Tax Committee. One, to look at the cigarette tax. We are 46th in the nation. We have an opportunity of bringing ourselves to parity with the rest of the nation, which I think is fair. I hope, take advantage of that revenue to match as much federal Medicaid as we can to bring down potentially $1 billion to the state of Florida. And there will be other benefits as well. We do know that there's a disproportionate impact on the cigarette tax. Disproportionately more young people stop smoking, and I think that's a side effect that's extremely positive. The second charge we have is to look at the streamlined sales tax. And there's been a lot reported about the streamlined sales tax, and an issue that I was extremely excited about and certainly been looking at with my staff, and we've had some public presentations and workshops because of the great inequity that exists today. I know many of you are aware of it, but to summarize, obviously, if you have a presence in Florida, you hire people, you pay taxes, you support our school system, you employ workers, if you provide a product over the internet or you sell it in your brick and mortar facility, you pay taxes. But if you pick up your stakes and you move out of Florida and you start shipping items in from outside, you pay nothing. Grossly unfair. It's a tax reform package that has overwhelming public support from all sectors of our state. But the problem is, how do you get there? The Supreme Court has ruled that any sort of requirement that an out-of-state company pay sales taxes is deemed a violation of the Interstate Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. And as a result of that, we know that over 20 states have formed a compact to try to address that, and the court ruled that one of the obstacles to interstate commerce is the complexity of the tax laws. 50 states, 50 different tax structures. So what over 20 states have done in the nation has formed a compact to streamline, and I'd really like the word unify. I think that more clearly defines what they're trying to do. Unify their tax structure so a business out of state that's part of that compact state has a similar tax structure in every state. So it removes that obstacle, that impediment of having diverse tax structures. That's a great thing. But the problem is, under federal law, if you're a part of the streamlined sales tax group, you're a part of the compact, it's still voluntary. A company, now I don't know about you, but how many companies do you know that really get excited about voluntarily paying taxes? Just doesn't happen. So it's still voluntary. Also, so joining the compact, passing the streamlined sales tax, unless we get a federal law, unless the federal government passes legislation that allows a state to require tax on goods that are imported into another state, it's going to be minimal. As a matter of fact, because of the change of our tax code, potential that in the streamlined compact could also revenue. So that's not the answer either. We're going to continue to look at it. You know, the other option, it always comes up in meetings, and I know all of you, it doesn't apply to you, that you know, enforce sales tax payment. And I know all of you that's purchased things in the last couple of years, downloaded the Department of Revenue form, you report all the sales tax you did not pay on internet purchases. But there are people, a lot of people that don't do that. The rumor is that only 1,100, 1,200 people that do that are Department of Revenue employees. So, but you know, that's a challenge, and we know, we all agree. I've been a part of the off and on in government since over 20 years. This is my 14th year of public service. You know, I don't think I've ever seen an issue where there's so much agreement on where we want to go, but yet just haven't figured out where we're getting there. And so, in this particular case, which is rare in the political world, consensus is not the problem, and agreement is not the problem. It's the technical challenge of how we get there. So we are open for ideas. And there's a lot of very smart people that have looked at this problem and have figured it out. Yeah, you know, TaxWatch can't get you one much smarter than that. So we're looking for a way that we hope we can get there. Of course, there's the federal fix, and there's a hope, and even some expectation that the stimulus package would include some provisions addressing the streamlined sales tax. And there was a lot of disappointment when it didn't happen. A lot of people felt that it was happening because it was an opportunity to provide economic stimulus, fairness in the tax structure without appropriating funds. But on the flip side of that, as politicians, elected officials in Washington voting on what some perceive as a tax on the internet without Washington receiving any of the revenue. So which side comes out, we don't know. And I always point out, this is not a tax on the internet. It's a fairness issue. Items that you would pay sales tax for, obviously you're not going to pay sales tax if you purchase something on the internet. If you purchase these items from Barnes & Noble or Walmart or any company that has a presence in Texas and Florida, you're going to pay those sales taxes. So it's a equal and fairness issue. And finally, our third chart, the Senate President task, our Finance and Tax Committee, he did it opening day in a special session. The third task is to look at sales tax exemptions. We know this happened before. We're going to give it another go this year. We will start hopefully tomorrow. We have some cigarette tax on the agenda at the beginning, and that may take most of our meeting. But we're going to start the process of looking at exemptions. It's going to be interesting to see where that goes. I can tell you perfectly that as far as Senate's concerned, with some exceptions, and obviously the income tax, tax on advertising, that's a little bit controversial. We're not going to go there. But a lot, just about everything else, is going to be on the table. Take an objective look, and our major theme will be that F word, fairness. And you know, we have two F words, fairness and what's best for Florida. So that's our theme. You know, we want to take a look at exemptions that may give one business an advantage over another. An exemption that may stifle productivity. Exemptions that promote wasteful behavior. Exemptions on items that are similar to other items, but for whatever reason they're taxed. We'll look at some exemptions that have been given for economic development, and really evaluate, are they still working? Are they doing the things that they were intended to do? Are they bringing jobs down to the state, or is the company new to the state only to take advantage of our sales tax exemption and continue to outsource? Those are things that we're going to look at. We'll probably look at, in some discussion in committee, are we better giving tax exemptions, or is it better to target revenue for economic incentives where you have more objective, more measurable objective? These are the titles. We want to develop, make it simple, some guided principles in terms of what and how we should tax public.
Any questions?
Develop that principle, and then
Have them after each speaker.
we want to develop that principle, and we want to run the exemptions through the filter and see how it's going to come out. Now, the House has taken an approach that's a little bit different. And I'm very pleased with John Bogdan, who's chair of the Finance and Tax Committee, and the House side, whom I've got a great deal of respect for and I'm working with her. They've assigned the exemption to each individual members of their committee, a group 5 or 10, and they've had each member come back and report. I'm not aware of any final conclusion that they've taken. We're going to take a little different approach. We're going to take a principle-based approach. We want to try to get politics of arguing this exemption or that exemption. Let's develop those principles, those standards, develop a filter, run them through an objective process, and just kind of see what happens. And then I think the political will probably start. But I do want to, I wanted to give you a sense of where the Senate is going. I think this is just the beginning. There are many other tax issues we're going to be addressing. Property tax. I truly feel that we have not solved the property tax issue in the state of Florida. The biggest issue is the unfairness issue. We have people living in the same street, virtually the same type of home, built at the same time, and one day paying twice the amount of taxes. I don't think we can truly reform our tax system until we take a look at the fairness problem in property taxes. Where a lot of people pay way too much in property taxes. And there are others that may not be paying for share. I think that one common theme that we must agree on as we begin this process is that the state of Florida has serious revenue problems. And if we do not fill this gap, we don't adequately fund the future for the quality of our life, the status of our state, and administration. The things that mean so much to us, our national heritage, the education of our children, our safe streets, are jeopardized by the loss of revenue. And I think there's been a lot of discussion in previous years, previous decades about how one day our tax system will come to haunt us, and that many of us should reform it. We don't know if this is a temporary downturn or the day of reckoning is upon us, where we may find ourselves in a permanent situation where we're going to either have to make changes or we will lose the state that we belong to.
We've got to break it off right now for our last speaker. Last but certainly not least, the President, CEO of Florida TaxWatch, Dominic M. Calabro.
Thank you. Bill, I'll try to answer your question. I'll let you ask it. Go ahead.
I think like all of us, we want to think like Americans as well as Floridians. We want to think long term. And I'm looking at this stimulus package that has an education component that says that as I understand it, and I admittedly have a superficial understanding, but if a state has cut their education funding, like, for example, Florida has in the last couple of years, despite the holding education harmless promise we had with property tax changes, that the states would not get the education portion of the stimulus. I guess because we want to think long term and use the stimulus for capital improvement rather than the everyday spending that we've been underfunding, apparently, compared to other states all these years. My question is, as an American, do you, and I ask this of you, Senator, because of your position, do you think that the stimulus bill should be, that condition should be waived for Florida, or would, either way, are you willing, are you interested as a leader of your committee in looking for ways to enhance revenues, if you will, to bring education funding back up to meet that criteria?
Let me answer the second one first. I think we need to bring funding back up in education. You know, there's nothing more important than the future of our youth. And if we are going to be competitive economically in this state, we must have a world-class education system. And you know, we had I think a very good governor, a very strong and very conservative governor who was committed to education with Governor Bush. And he felt that a $72 billion budget was necessary for this state. And now we're down in the low 60s. We've cut to the bone, and we must bring it back. Even when we're at that level, I mean, I think our education was I mean, we've seen improvements. We've seen student performance improve. We've had a renaissance in education. I know, Carol, I differ a little bit on innovation. I think one area Florida has been an innovator is education. For example, our virtual school is the envy of the country. We actually provide virtual education for other states. The Florida Virtual School is in contract with other states in this union to provide virtual education. We've done a lot of good things in the education world, and if we don't bring our level of funding back up, we're just going to throw everything we've achieved out. So regardless of what happens with the stimulus package, we need to bring the funding back up. Whether I think they should waive this, I think they obviously, for the benefit of education, I would want to see that requirement waived, for fear that what if we didn't, we couldn't get the political sort to bring the money back up, then we would lose all that revenue. But regardless of that, I think we must, if I may, Dominic, just quickly, I think it's critical that we don't allow the stimulus package to become a means of avoiding the problem that we have in this state, hiding behind a tree and not facing our own problem. We need to address our revenue problems, and if we do that, we can make that stimulus package more beneficial and actually make it a true stimulus package, not one that's going to kind of serve as a Band-Aid to fix our revenue shortfall. So people ask me about that stimulus package, and the money's necessary, but I'm not going to let that in any way get my eye off the ball in fixing our tax problem in the state.
Okay, thank you. Bill, as I started, I want to answer your question in part. There's two challenges you have to do. One, Florida had some reductions, if you will, from the artificial. Florida, it's hard to believe I didn't talk loud enough. Florida actually had a reduction in some education spending, in part for two reasons. One, we had reduced student enrollment. That's unprecedented. I think 2, if not 3 years in a row of a seismic nature. That's number one. So I think there's a legitimate reason that when students are no longer there, that you don't provide funding for kids that are no longer there. It seems kind of silly not to consider that for a waiver. Secondly, we also have something that probably is inefficient, and by virtually every empirical evaluation, Democrats, Republicans alike recognize that we are spending on a recurring basis, not just the capital, but $2 to $4 billion annually on class size that has little or no impact on student academic achievement. Now, I actually think that class size for district averages probably now makes some sense. We ought to lock it in there, but not each school site, and certainly not each individual class itself. It's so inflexible as to be not only impractical, but counterproductive to educating each and every child. So we're locked up in wasting money of a magnitude larger than we have even an opportunity to lose. I want to thank the senator, both actually, Senator Thad Altman and Dan Gelber, both good friends to the people of Florida, the taxpayers of Florida, and Florida TaxWatch. We have really worked through these very, very, very well, and we're glad to see that for a citizen legislature, we've got some distinguished Floridians that are serving in these critical positions of leadership. And also want to thank Liz Joyner and Alan Katz for inviting us to participate in this. I think this is really wonderful. I wish we had more time, but more in exchange. But what we're facing here is running the ship of state through rough waters of a seismic economic and fiscal storm. And more than that, it's not just a cyclical thing. It's not just actually Florida led the nation in a recession, and then it later followed with a national recession. On top of that, an incredible liquidity crisis and credit crisis, a crisis in our fundamental financial systems that have not been felt or experienced since the Great Depression. This is really not merely an issue of do we have enough revenue, are we spending too much, too little? Those are the superficial problems we're facing. We have teutonic challenges in our plates, the undergirding of our basic fabric of our economy and to some extent, our political system. And so we're kind of guiding this in a very, very difficult set of circumstances that are many of which are far beyond our control. I think if you, in the short term, I think we cannot tax our way out of this economic and fiscal problem, but also I don't think we're willing to take the time enough to really, really go through and have the surgical assessment and reductions in spending. When you cut across the board, it's very counterproductive. You're cutting the effective, the efficient with the ineffective, woefully inefficient. And frankly, usually the people that went out are bureaucracies that have been calcified and pretty inefficient. Okay, so that really doesn't work. We've offered, TaxWatch offered, and we had great response from the legislature, the House and Senate, during the special session, offering some 30-plus ideas, and they really, really worked on it. Democrats, Republicans alike, particularly Republican leadership in the Senate. I really want to give Senator J.D. Alexander and Senate President Jeff Atwater the real lead on it. Dean Cannon in the House took it and really but D's and R's, Democrats and Republicans, said this is the way to cut the budget, not across the board. We have to do things to cut some of the Medicaid waste and efficiency. We know it exists. It's about 22 to 23%. And I heard before, and I hear feel the pain of these chairmen of these committees. Senator Don Gates was in the Senate Health Regulatory Committee, and he was asking the Agency for Health and ACA, how much have you collected from either fraud, waste, or excessive payments? And $16 million out of a $16 billion budget. I mean, and they know a lot, but what are we doing? And sometimes we stop ourselves. Sometimes we make the processes so difficult that we forget the forest from the tree. This, as they say, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And not just mean politically, but it's a great opportunity, and I'm afraid we're going to lose it, because it's a great opportunity to fix and realign, bring some common sense to how we spend money. I really wish we spent, if you will, the next 60 days really looking intensely. The first 60, how do we spend the money? As Dr. Kaufman pointed out, and others, what are the core functions? The courts are a core function. We ought to be fully funding the court system. There are other areas at which we can't really nickel and dime at our own peril. Smart things in education. There are things, early learning. We're foolish not to invest there. And also make sure we get the desired results, not just the funding, but the desired measurable results in those areas. We pay dearly when we don't. When we don't vaccinate kids, we don't give perinatal, prenatal care. We pay dearly. It's not like maybe, we know we do. We put too much time and effort in the back end in our prisons. And I'm glad that one of the recommendations TaxWatch said was, wait, before we build 3 new prisons at the expense of $324 million, and by the way, try to bond it. I mean, I'm sorry, did we not hear that there's a liquidity crisis? And many times you can't bond anything. So we said, let's look at alternatives. We went from 81,000, I see my friend Allison DeFore who's doing so much work in this area, prison reform, and former Secretary of Corrections Jim McDonough. We went from 81,000 prisoners to over 100,000 in 5 years. Okay, back end, almost a wasteful expense. A lot of those are non-violent offenders, many just drug possession. Okay, there are clear 3 or 4 meaningful results, some of which are already on the books. Use them, extend them to avoid that cost. Put the money where it could do some real good. So we're glad they're looking at those. But anyway, there's a great many things we can do. I know my time's limited, so I just want to say, among other things, there's still many more ideas in here that they should do. I'd like to see the first 60 days on spending. I'd like to see, and if that's not sufficient, and I think it probably won't be. I think there's only so much that a concerted effort that's fully dedicated to getting the spending right, try to streamline the regulatory process can yield. There's just so much you can do. But if we were to really reduce it in a meaningful way, half of the $6 billion, I'd say that is a heck of a good day's work. And then the remaining part, okay, we've tried it. We've already done the spending side. If TaxWatch has more ideas, or this group or that group, we're all ears. But we've already exhausted that. Now, since we've done that, we're closing that down for a while, unless you got a better idea. And now we're going to look at tax compliance, which I think they ought to do anyway. I don't think there's billions in tax compliance, but I think there's several $100 million. Okay, a tax amnesty. We listed them on pages 12 and 13 of this report. We've spoken with the Department of Revenue. Before you get the fairness word, before you ask someone to pay their fair share, I think there's a legal compelling argument to make sure people pay their lawful share. Okay, why should someone have to pay more taxes when there has not been a reasonable effort for the state to make sure people are paying their legal share, and from remote sales to facilitating proper reviews. So there's a lot there. I think it's in the area of a few hundred million, $300 to $400 million, and we identified them by source. But after that, I think you've got to look at the fact that we're changing. Our tax system in Florida is really based on what Dr. Weiser really said. Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the non-voter behind the tree. Here's a short civics lesson in Florida's tax system. Senator Altman really pointed out very, very wisely. We have, on property taxes, we give boatloads of benefit and went overboard on the homesteaded voter property owner, okay? Little or none to the new resident coming in, the out-of-state resident coming in. I think it borders on challenge, our potential Commerce Clause violations and right to travel. As the expert that the state paid for warned him about, Senator Altman was right. The alternative that they chose to not accept that he helped vote for and others would have given the super homestead. It really was a good fix. It was structural, it was sound, and it would have been beneficial. But we did go that, we went with the easier route, and now we're kind of stuck with that. But from property taxes, we have corporate income, we don't have personal income, we have no inheritance, no estate tax, intangibles now statutorily is eliminated. If you look at our tax system, it's really a bane to individuals, particularly the voters. We've designed a great system for the 60s, 70s, and maybe 80s. It's just, unfortunately, a little out of touch with this century, which is based on global competition. So we discourage through, I'll tell you, even sales tax, good example. At every tax commission that's been existed since World War II, sales tax, we tax electricity, commercial electricity. We exempt residential electricity, okay? I'm not saying we should tax it not, but just get the picture here. Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the non-voter behind the tree. Basically, we tax businesses and voters, people who don't vote, okay, directly. Pest control, we tax commercial pest control, we exempt residential pest control. We tax commercial rents, we exempt residential rents. Now, what you really have here is a situation that if you really were to do the kind of things, if we taxed residential rent, residential pest control, residential lawn care, things like that, people by nature cannot go to the Bahamas to avoid paying it. The can of pest control spray, for fairness, is simply poor people pay the sales tax for their pest control when they go to Publix or Walmart or whatever to buy that can of paint spray, right, Sandy? But the pest control service, they don't pay. Okay? So you can add fairness, and you won't have the dislocation because if you tax personal services, people aren't going to go to Atlanta or Wyoming to avoid it. But business will. Tax advertising, besides the storm you'll hear politically, you'll have other things. The long and short of it is that we have met the enemy is us. We have a great opportunity to both fix the spending and I think reform our tax system to create some balance. And the underlying theme here is the balance that strongly encourages and recognize we live in a competitive world. People don't just come here for sunshine. Business can sell into our markets, but we must attract them to bring their capital, their payroll, their people, and their offices here. Because they can go into almost any zip code in the state because of technology and other barriers that are now removed. So we need to design a tax system that encourages entrepreneurship. Ours does not. We tax too many business inputs, even on the sales and use tax. And so I think TaxWatch has identified how to do the sales. We shared with the chairman how to do this thoughtfully. No one's done it to date like this. We took all the exemptions and exclusions and said, here are the exclusions and exemptions which are structural. Here's what's for life necessities. And here are those by citation which you need to compete. The others, we're looking at probably several hundred million to in the low $1 or $2 billion range. But it's a healthy dialogue. The key, though, is really to say we want to make people, encourage them to come into our state. We should look at our corporate income tax as well and maybe encourage some way of encouraging companies to bring their payrolls and plants in Florida. So great opportunity, great solutions. I think we agree with many of the recommendations discussed, but it's going to be hard to get all this done in the next 60 days.
Thank you, Dominic. We have time for just a couple quick questions.
Dom, I'm asking this question because Allison DeFore is too shy.
Never.
What kind of legislative reception have you been getting to your excellent proposal that we look at our prison system as a very inefficient and extremely costly system? And I think you've given us some of the figures, but my memory is that the Secretary of Corrections says that we are going to have to build 19 new prisons in the next 5 years at a cost of $100 million per prison and a cost of $27 million a year for each prison. If I'm tallying that up right, that's about $1.9 billion in capital cost over the next 5 years, and then $500 million additional each year to operate those new 19 prisons, plus the expenditures we're already making. But you indicate that some great savings could be developed by looking at the prison system. Are legislators paying any attention?
Sandy, I think they are. Let me try to answer quickly. I think they are mainly because they have to. Okay? I think the first thing we had to overcome, which we're finally beginning to overcome on a fiscal issue, the remote sales tax. We spent much of the last 6 years just in an ideological discussion that this is going to make government grow. We said that's ridiculous. Roll the sales tax rate back down, equivalent to the money you collected on remote sales, and you'll grow government. You'll just add fairness and remove a clear, compelling competitive disadvantage for Florida businesses, for Florida retail employees that have a 6 to 7.5% cost disadvantage that we're creating on our own people. It's madness and silly. I once said the legislature's a bunch of knuckleheads over it, and I walked out of a session, and there was a member of the legislature who didn't like me calling him a knucklehead. It wasn't used that. But the other one is, the first thing we had to overcome, and we're not being soft on crime. Okay, we're not being, weak or soft. So TaxWatch speaking on it, I think brings that, fiscal toughness, if you will. We believe there's at least currently 3,000 inmates within 14 months of release in supervised but unsecured facilities. We have the wherewithal to avoid this one. We need some more concerted efforts that Allison, Jim McDonough, and others, and even Secretary McNeil, I think they're now looking. Senator Victor Crist in the Tampa area is very serious about this. I think there are meaningful ways of bringing it back down to reality. Ultimately, folks, we really have one of two things. We're not going to bring our revenues from where they were. They've fallen 5 years. We're not going to bring them back up to where they were 1 or 2 years ago, not for a long time. So our spending and as much as our workload factors we can reduce that have been artificially inflated, there's some we can't. Lots of things we just can't do right away. But that's one I think we can control and one we should and must. And doing so allows us to put the money in schools and in education and in the economy of today and tomorrow. And we do not do so at our own peril.
Unfortunately, we've gone beyond the time, unless you all want to stay for a few minutes. Those who have to leave, Liz, is that okay with you? If you have to leave, we promised 7 o'clock, but it's going over, but we've got more questions, and this seems like a good discussion, so we'll knock them out here. All right, yes, sir. Your name?
Hi, Doug Turner, Turner Heritage Homes. Got a question about, Dominic, maybe you can ask, or anybody can answer this question as far as it relates to property taxes on a different level. I'm in the home building business and land development business, and clearly with all this activity in the crisis among property values have gone down a lot. Residential homes have gone down, probably we're getting close to values in 2000, maybe 1998 in some areas. And so eventually those property taxes are going to have to be reset. I believe after watching this for the last 2 years, this downturn, we'll have to face a reset. And that's going to affect the actual revenues we eventually do get in property taxes and commercial property, commercial buildings, residential lots have all got to be reset in order to bring those prices down. The bankers aren't going to like that are holding the notes, but that's going to be reality. Any comments on how that's going to affect our revenue and our planning for the future?
Yes, we actually joked about it years past when there was some national recession in the early 90s. It was interesting that property appraisers were a little slow on the uptake on reappraising property when it went down, but seem to be real quick on the uptake when they rise. It's just a little bit of human nature and the pressure they get from the spenders. It's just human nature. Not unlike price increases in the marketplace. You'll see the price of oil fall, but gasoline not fall. But by law, they're supposed to be actually physically re-examined every 2 years. I think one challenge you should do, every property owner, is make sure that you've done your own initial assessment of comparable sales and other comps with income and other things. So you have a right under the law and should reasonably assess, and then if you feel it's unfair and improper and doesn't reflect the reduced market you have a right to challenge those assessments, and you should. And if you don't, shame on you. I don't think you should pay more nor less than the law requires.
I'm assuming everybody's going to do that.
They haven't, and they probably won't. No. No. Most people will rather complain. They will curse the darkness than light one candle. That's unfortunately the case.
Okay, Dominic, we have former Representative Richardson.
Thank you. You all have talked a lot about taxes and what needs to be done, and we discussed this ad nauseum in the legislature, and it was always a patchwork of proposals that came forward, and yet we squandered a once in a 20-year constitutionally mandated opportunity rather than take a comprehensive look at our tax system and address all of these issues. We preferred, the commission, preferred to push school vouchers that were eventually not allowed on the ballot. My question is, in light of that, do you all think that, and I think that local governments, one of the problems that I had with how we handled this situation as a legislature, we saw local government as the enemy, rather than inviting them to be our partners. And there were some very responsible local governments that had put aside some emergency funds. But we saw and treated local government as the enemy rather than our partners in this, and us all coming and sitting around the table and coming up with a solution. Do you see that, or any of you who might want to answer it, as something that might be viable moving forward to bring local government to the table with the legislature that does not have all the answers, clearly, to come up with a solution to the tax issue that we find ourselves in Florida, and get away from this patchwork that we've done over the years?
Sandy was one of the distinguished members of the Taxation Budget Reform Commission. We worked very hard on helping to create it in 1988. We felt it was really necessary to meet every 10 years. I really wish that was the case. I wish they were able to come back and meet. We actually were chartered. I think the commission could have acted for 3 years rather than just from 07 through 08. I think the time frame was too short. I think also the chair of the committee was a good friend, a wonderful, great Floridian, a wonderful speaker, but I think he was honestly too deferential to the legislature. I didn't read in the charge of that commission that we should do this unless the legislature kind of wants to do it. I didn't read that. I missed that point. But he did, and it was just nature being former speaker. And I think we also greatly missed an incredible opportunity of doing things like a family, like a small business, like a retiree has to operate their household, their finances. We should have spent time on spending. And what are the core functions? That's what the commission was charged with. How do we spend the hard-earned money of the taxpayers of Florida? Not whether we're 50th or 2nd or 3rd or 10th, but do we know what the core functions are required by our Constitution? When it says education is a primary or fundamental responsibility, do we treat it as such? When we say pre-K for 4-year-olds is really serious and meaningful, do we treat it as such? We know the courts are core function, do we really treat it as such? And there's a lot of other things we could do, maybe should do when times are really well. We didn't do that. We missed a colossal, tremendous opportunity. Then also further on the tax structure to meet that. Okay, so I don't see that happening, Curtis. I would like to say it would. The other problem I have, and it's like this: when you're looking for $3 billion, guess what? You're likely to find it. But are you going to find it all in the right places? You're not likely to. It's just human nature, and they got a tough job on their hands. I feel the chairman's pain. It's going to be tough no matter what he does. If he taxes something, it's tough. If he doesn't, then it's spending cuts or some other efficiencies you have to get rid of. The more we can come up with honest, meaningful efficiencies, duplications, the better it is to get the job done. But no answers are easy. We just hope that they're principled. And we hope that they're better than what we currently have in a very, very difficult situation.
All righty. Any additional comments, questions? All righty. Well, on behalf of the Lori Collins Institute, Florida TaxWatch, the state senators who were kind enough to share their time, I'd like to thank To the Village Square and Liz and Alec. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming.